Hello, I'm Linor Moudou. Welcome to Africa 54. Here is what's coming up. President Joe Biden hosts a NATO summit in Washington with Ukraine's defense against Russia high on the agenda. Italy's new development-focused strategy aims to curb migrant crossing from Africa, potentially setting a precedent for European migration policies. The UNHCR reports a severe humanitarian crisis in Sudan, with hundreds of thousands of children on the verge of starvation. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. We begin here in Washington, where President Joe Biden welcomes members of the newly enlarged NATO alliance this week for a summit aimed at planning for Ukraine's future defense. And some observers say Trump-proofing it if Biden loses the November poll amid growing doubts over his future. VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell reports from the White House.
The big question the transatlantic alliance faces at this summit is, how much longer can Ukraine hold on? And for Americans, and a growing list of quietly worried allies, the same can be asked of the man who casts himself as Ukraine's biggest champion, President Joe Biden. On Monday, the 81-year-old Biden said he's staying in the presidential race amid a growing list of calls for him to step aside after his shaky debate performance last month. The White House on Monday refuted questions that NATO allies are concerned that these cracks at the leadership level could put the 75-year-old alliance on shaky ground as it meets in Washington this week.
We're not picking up any signs of that from our allies at all, quite the contrary. The conversations that we're having with them in advance, they're excited about this summit, they're excited about the possibilities and the things that we're going to be doing together, specifically to help Ukraine.
Analysts say that while NATO leaders are indeed worried, they are being careful to not be seen as meddling in U.S. politics.
I think there is a concern in NATO. The leaders of the NATO countries may not love Joe Biden. But if we look back to the Trump administration, he said a number of things that were really anti-NATO. And I think, with all honesty, that most NATO countries would prefer Biden, again, not necessarily because they're so pro-Biden, but because of the things that Trump has said and threatened to do about NATO. But they don't want to necessarily say a lot about this publicly because it looks like they're interfering in American elections, which is not something they're supposed to do.
And there are other cracks among leaders in the alliance. Hungary's far-right leader recently visited Russian President Vladimir Putin and cast himself as a bridge between the two adversaries. At this summit, the 32-member group plans to take over Washington's role coordinating Ukraine's defense.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the last 2.5 years, there are fewer and now remain hardly any who are able to speak with both warring parties. Hungary is one of very few.
One thing unlikely to happen during the summit, a breakthrough in the conflict. Putin says Ukraine is not ready to discuss terms, which he says includes the retreat of Ukrainian troops from the 4 regions Russia says it has annexed. Ukraine seeks a just peace that includes all of its territory, and Ukraine's leader will attend this week's summit to press his case for that and for NATO membership in the future. The alliance meets Tuesday in Washington. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
For more on day one of the NATO Alliance Summit in Washington, D.C., Carla Babb, VOA Pentagon correspondent, joins us live from the Washington Convention Center. Carla, thanks for joining us. What are we expecting today?
Well, good evening. NATO allies here are trying to show the world that NATO is stronger than ever, despite what my White House colleague said, a big war still remaining on its eastern flank and clear uncertainty as who will be the next president of the United States. President Joe Biden is going to mark the occasion of NATO's 75th anniversary just a few minutes down the road at Mellon Auditorium, and that is where the initial signing of the North Atlantic Treaty was in 1949. And he is, in addition to welcoming that occasion, he is also going to be welcoming Sweden in as the 32nd member of NATO. NATO is the largest it's ever been, and officials are saying that the mission of NATO is just as important now as it was when it was put together in 1949. That mission was to stop the Soviet Union from expanding into Eastern Europe. And with Russia invading Ukraine, they look at that and they say NATO is definitely still relevant.
So, Carla, this is the 75th anniversary, as you mentioned. It's really a milestone when it comes to anniversaries. What are the main focuses of this year's summit?
Well, I'm hearing three main focuses at this summit. The first is commitments matter. They are looking to shore up defense spending for all of the 32 allies. They made a commitment, all of the member nations made a commitment to increase their defense spending to 2% of their GDP by 2024. 23 of the 32 nations have done that. There will be a lot of praise for those nations, a lot of pressure on those who haven't. The second thing that they want to focus on, I'm being told, is that Ukraine matters. Even though Ukraine is not in NATO, officials are telling me that it's not a matter of if Ukraine will join NATO, but when Ukraine will join NATO. And President Joe Biden, when he meets with President Zelensky of Ukraine, he wants to reassure President Zelensky that membership will be coming, even though it's not coming this year. There's also an increased push for support for Ukraine. The U.S. really stood up the Ukraine Defense Contact Group and took the lead to gather nations together, more than 50 nations together, to support Ukraine. But in the future, they want to make sure that it's not just the United States doing that NATO can handle that as well. And the final thing that they are looking into is a commitment that allies matter. I mean, Russia has been using increased cooperation with Iran, China, and North Korea. That's why it's not just NATO allies here. They're bringing in Indo-Pacific nations, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan to come and meet as well to show that democracies will be defended.
Okay, thank you so much, Carla, for joining us. Tala Bab, VOA Pentagon correspondent, reporting live from the NATO Summit in Washington, D.C. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed met Sudan's Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan on Tuesday. He is the first foreign leader to visit al-Burhan in his war capital, Port Sudan, since the start of the conflict between the army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF. Abiy, who was previously seen as closer to the RSF than the army and hosted its leader Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo in Addis Ababa in December, framed the visit as part of a push to bring stability to Sudan after nearly 15 months of conflict. The visit took place after an RSF attack on the southeastern state of Sennar last month brought the war closer to Sudan's border. The war between the Sudanese military factions has forced almost 10 million people from their homes, creating famine-like conditions in parts of the country and threatened to destabilize the region. Italy's government is trying a new development-focused approach to prevent migrants from attempting to cross the Mediterranean from Africa. Analysts say the plan, if it works, could serve as a model for all of Europe. For VOA, Henry Wilkins reports from the Italian island of Lampedusa, where residents are welcoming the measure after thousands arrived there in a single week last year.
Italian fisherman Partenico Vincenzo was at sea one morning in 2022 when he spotted a boat of 24 migrants trying to cross to Europe from Africa. He sailed to it, and before he knew it, the migrants were jumping onto his boat. There was nothing else to do but help them, he says.
I thought about their family. I thought a lot about the fact that we are only on this earth once and must help each other. I tried to do everything I could.
Vincenzo is not the only Lampedusa fisherman who has become an accidental rescuer of migrants in this sea. Fishermen here, along with Italian authorities, pick up migrants almost every day. About 95,000 migrants arrived on Lampedusa over 12 months, starting June 1st, 2023. Since January, the Italian government has put in place a new policy known as the Mattei Plan to try and stem the flow. Italy hopes the plan will redefine its relationship with Africa, stimulating development and creating jobs, and deterring migrants from leaving their countries of origin.
Is exactly this, using public funds to improve the investment climate. Africa needs investments.
Addressing irregular migration is to say something must change.
Because shouldn't happen that in these years people arriving through the Mediterranean Sea that is so dangerous and so risky, and there are many people that are losing their lives, or they are losing relatives or friends.
Itzako disagrees with the current policies of Italy and other nations of Europe funding security forces in African states that routinely push back migrants. Vincenzo says he would like to see more cooperation to end the dangerous sea crossings and relieve pressure on Lampedusa's residents.
For me, it is a very normal thing not to see these deaths, and if the international community could reach an agreement, I am convinced that many deaths could be avoided.
Officials say more than 3,000 people died trying to cross the Mediterranean last year. Migrant activists believe many others have gone unreported. Henry Wilkins, VOA News, Lampedusa, Italy.
In Britain, the controversial asylum deal between the UK and Rwanda faces imminent collapse after newly elected UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that the Labour government will scrap it. The UK government has spent more than £320 million on the plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. In Kigali, capital city of Rwanda, preparations were in full swing. Rwanda was ready to receive immigrants from the UK under the controversial migration partnership between the two governments. Hostels had been built and equipped with recreational amenities, and over 150 people had been hired and trained to work in these facilities. However, Starmer confirmed the Rwanda deportation scheme is, quote, dead and buried in his first press conference as Prime Minister. 3 asylum seekers who brought court action to block the UK's attempt to send them to Rwanda had their cases resolved on Tuesday after the incoming Labour government ditched the policy. So what next? What happens to all the investments that have been made in Rwanda to accommodate migrants? For more perspective, Mika Wong, a journalist and analyst on migrations issues, joins us from Latina, Italy. Michela, welcome to Africa 54. What is your understanding of why the Rwanda deportation plan was cancelled? How has the UK government justified it?
Yes, just to correct, I am not an expert on asylum issues. I'm an expert on Africa. But yes, the Labour Party, when it was in opposition and when it was running for election, had always said that it would cancel this deal. It did not believe in the deal. It thought it didn't act as a deterrent. The deal had been presented to the British public by the Conservative Party as likely to deter all these small boats crossings, as they're called, where people get into small boats in Calais and put their lives in their hands crossing the channel. The Labour had always said it won't be a deterrent, and also took very seriously the point that was made by UNHCR and also many of the asylum NGOs, which is firstly that Rwanda is not a safe place to send asylum seekers to, and secondly that Britain would be violating its own legal obligations and a variety of European human rights legislation that it has signed up to. So Labour had always said it would scrap the deal, and that's what it's done. And it announced that it was scrapping the deal, right from the get-go, which again is what it had said it would do. So I think the question now is, why was so much money spent ahead of time? We understand that between £250 million and £270 million was spent without any asylum seekers being deported to the country. there were 4 people who went voluntarily and actually received payments of £3,000 a head. But they stepped forward and said they wanted to go. But the whole idea that this policy deterred asylum seekers and was going to be the great silver bullet that a right-wing government here in the UK was searching and was seeking has collapsed.
So let me ask you, what impact will this cancellation have on the migrants, the asylum seekers that were slated to be sent to Rwanda?
Well, a lot of them had been detained. 200 of them had been rounded up in the UK and put into detention facilities, waiting to be loaded onto planes and flown out to Rwanda. They are now being released. And in fact, they are suing the British government for compensation for being detained in that way. I imagine that they will be feeling very relieved, but their lawyers will also be arguing that they have suffered all sorts of trauma and very unpleasant detention conditions. But I think, what we're going to see is going to be a shift in policy, and we will wait and see how effective that is. What the Labour Party is saying, and what the government has announced, including the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, she's saying they're going to focus on the gangs, the trafficking gangs.
Okay, Michaela, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay.
Mika Wong is a journalist and analyst on migrations. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden says he's staying in the race for re-election against former President Donald Trump after Biden struggled in their first debate. VOA correspondent Scott Stearns looked at what U.S. voters think about the president's continuing candidacy.
The Biden campaign is pushing back against calls for their candidate to step aside following his debate struggles, with $50 million in paid media for July and an aggressive campaign schedule this week. Biden told a Wisconsin rally Friday that he's staying in the race. Voter Sabrina Jordan says he's still a viable candidate.
He should be consistent. He should be, I won't say defiant, but somewhere between consistent and defiant. He needs to let people know, and he did today, that he ain't going nowhere. And unless something changes dramatically, he is the man for me.
Voter Jonathan Lustag was not so sure.
The physiology that he displayed, he is not the same man. You can't turn back. We're not getting younger. You can't beat old age.
Seeing Biden back on the campaign trail after the debate does not ease the concerns of registered Democrat Ellis Johnston.
I don't feel confident in Joe Biden's ability to win this election, and that makes me very afraid.
For Trump supporters, Biden's sometimes halting debate performance reconfirmed their view that he's not fit for another term. California voter Lamont Pearson.
There's nothing that can come out of Joe Biden's mouth to make me think anything other than what he's already shown me, as well as Trump.
Biden's debate performance is not the whole picture, says Georgia voter Jeffrey Tanarelli.
I think Joe Biden is very passionate and very intelligent. I think he did not perform well because he did not meet the expectations, and his performance was what people expected of him.
That lack of energy leaves Washington, D.C. voter Hannah Zabolovich open to a new candidate.
It was kind of clear to me that maybe Biden's not as with it as he used to be, and I think I'd be supportive if someone, they put up another candidate rather than Biden.
If Democrats are to have a different nominee, they need to move quickly, says Michigan voter Alexis Zaidan.
There's a lot of conversations that need to happen within the next, month around what could the Democratic Party do to bring all of its, fractured vote, like its fractured base back to its core and hopefully build strong ahead of November, or we will be looking at a Trump presidency.
Biden's vice president and running mate Kamala Harris would be at the top of the list to replace him as the party's candidate. But that may not work, says California voter Stephanie Bowers.
Kamala would take over, which I would love, but I also think with the world being the way it is, all the prejudice going on, that Trump would probably beat Kamala more so than beating Biden.
Pushing ahead with Biden as the nominee, his campaign has First Lady Jill Biden meeting with military families in 3 states this week, and the president counter-programming next week's Republican Party convention with remarks in Texas and Nevada. Scott Stearns, VOA News.
We'll be right back.
on the next Straight Talk Africa. Leaders of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, gather in Washington to commemorate 75 years of the alliance. The summit is set to address pressing global challenges and reinforce the organization's strategic direction. Join me, Vincent McCory, on the next edition of Straight Talk Africa as we take a closer look at NATO's milestones over the decades and what nature of relationship exists between the military alliance and the African Union.
African governments are wrestling with rising food prices, gas shortages, as well as other economic challenges. Many non-governmental organizations are having to increase their effort in supporting the vulnerable in society. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we'll hear what is being done by Africans for Africans to curb hunger and malnutrition and the women behind the work. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, South Sudanese are celebrating their independence Tuesday, July 9th. In 2011, South Sudan became the world's newest nation after decades of civil war in Sudan. In a statement, the United States called on South Sudan's leaders to take the steps necessary to meet citizens' expectations and to guarantee their people a future of peace and the ability to choose their leaders through genuine and peaceful elections. Liberia's President Joseph Boakai will cut his salary by 40%, a move he says is aimed at, quote, setting a precedent for responsible governance as the country battles poverty and corruption. Boakai was sworn in for a 6-year term in January and has pledged to improve living conditions for Liberians, tackle widespread corruption, and uphold the rule of law. Now, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR's 2024 Global Trends Report reveals that since April 2023, more than 7.1 million people have been displaced within Sudan and almost 2 million have been forced to flee to neighboring countries. Humanitarian agencies warn that refugee camps are overcrowded and underfunded, lacking essential services such as clean water, sanitation, and healthcare. Hundreds of thousands of children in war-torn Sudan are on the verge of starvation and at risk of dying as the African country is caught in a bitter war between rival generals. According to the UN, about 4 million children under 5 suffer from acute malnutrition. A preliminary projection by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification states that more than 750,000 people will suffer catastrophic food shortages in the coming months.
So the war in Sudan has been ongoing for over a year now, and the situation is catastrophic across a country that is the third one most populated in Africa. It's a country the size of countries like Spain in terms of population, nearly 50 million, half of them are in need of humanitarian assistance, a fifth of them have been forced out of their homes. Today, people in Sudan are lacking a proper shelter, food, they are lacking access to healthcare. Many health structures are not functional, particularly in the conflict areas, and the situation is desperate. And we are already seeing a problem of malnutrition in different areas of Sudan. For example, in North Darfur state, in the Sansan camp where MSF teams are working, we did a mass screening of more than 40,000 children, in total about 60,000 plus children and breastfeeding women and pregnant women. And the rates of malnutrition were very, very high, above the emergency threshold. Vaccines are running short in many areas of the country. And this is why we are also very concerned, because in the past year, we have already seen different outbreaks of disease, for example, of measles, for example, of cholera. And this is something that can be recurrent if action is not taken, if vaccines are not provided to the children, to the vulnerable groups. No? So what we are calling is for the United Nations to exert an adequate leadership at the height of this crisis, but also to the other international organizations to step up their efforts to provide assistance, and to the authorities, to both warring parties, to allow unimpeded access to the populations in need wherever they are, no? Because we think that part of the problem in scaling up the response to the current situation in Sudan is the obstructions that we are facing by the different authorities. We are talking about the probably either one of the highest displacement crises. We are talking about nearly 10 million people that in the course of the last year have been forced out of their homes. And we are talking about a crisis that is profoundly neglected by the international community. There is barely attention being paid to what's happening in Sudan. We need that people pay more attention about what's happening in Sudan, because there is a lot of suffering and much more can be done, and should be done soon. Yeah?
Zimbabwe is facing long hours of power cuts due to its dilapidated infrastructure and the impact of recurring droughts on hydropower. Help is on the way. Columbus Maguvuga reports from Bulawayo.
Health centers in 15 countries have installed solar power through the United Nations Development Programme's Solar for Health project. That includes more than 1,000 health centers in Zimbabwe, the largest program in the world, says UNDP resident representative in Zimbabwe, Aloyadele Odusola.
If you put all the renewable energy capacity that we have generated in the country, is 13.03 megawatts, which account for 35% of all independent power production, the one that is not done by government. Is huge as an individual entity.
Zimbabwe has for years been facing energy shortages. Long hours of power cuts affect even hospitals. Dr. Nasisi Janga is the Chief Medical Officer at Impilo Central Hospital, one of the health institutions which have benefited from the Solar for Health project.
All the news that used to make the headlines in the newspapers that Impilo has no electricity for 2 days, 3 days, that should be a thing of the past. It's a real game changer.
Tandazani Chingila is happy his father's prostate cancer operation went through at Impilo Central Hospital without a power shortage.
Impilo is off-grid now, which means Impilo will totally be independent because of this solar, so which is marvelous to us.
Authorities hope the switch to solar energy is seamless at all health facilities in Zimbabwe installed with solar power, and access is released to the national grid. Columbus Mavungam, VOA News, Bulawayo.